everybody. So I'm just going to pop a few things in here that are on my mind right now. And they're just random things that are popping up. I'm not sure what to do with them yet. So seeing as how I'm drastically decreasing where it is I'm placing thoughts, and this seems to be about the only place I'm doing it right now, here we go. I heard an interesting tale yesterday about Lemuria and Atlantis that just made a lot of sense. Way more sense than it probably should have made. The idea was that Lemuria and Atlantis existed at the same time. And honestly, actually, you know what? I don't know. I'll try to figure out the video, how to link the video or something. I'm not very good at editing, so whatever. I'll just probably put a link somewhere. But anyway, she was talking about Lemuria and Atlantis existed at the same time. Lemuria. Okay, first of all, what you need to understand is that the message I'm presenting is not necessarily the message that she was presenting. Because I've noticed this really odd thing in me. It started at church once I went back. It's probably been going on longer, but it's like my brain finally started making sense of it and finally started being able to bifurcate information. So the idea is that I'm listening to a message, like the sermon at church, and there's a movie going on in my head showing me other things, or there's a voice telling me other things to consider. You know, like, so like the preacher up in the front will say something, and all of a sudden I'll just hear or think or whatever, however you want to term that, clairaudient or clairsentience, I don't know. But well, have you considered it from this perspective? Have you considered it from this perspective? Well, what if you considered this? Or just something else being added into the narrative that I'm listening to, okay? So here is what I gathered from the story. And so Lemuria and Atlantis existed at the same time on Earth. And Lemuria was the feminine right brain. Lemuria was connected to the oneness. There was an innocence, but there was also naivety. It was all love and no understanding of, logic or, emotions that might create division. Okay. And then there was Atlantis, which, I considered more masculine, left brain, and logical, technological, and in many ways they were militant, and you could say that the Lemurians were what we would consider loving. Atlantis figured out how to come to Lemuria, because Atlantis was in Antarctica and Lemuria was in the Pacific Ocean. Atlantis figured out how to come to Lemuria, took it over, killed everyone. Some of them stayed behind, but they could not stay behind for very long, and the majority of them left back to Atlantis. So some of the Lemurians also survived and ended up fleeing to Hawaii. Now you have supposedly 3 groups of people. It's kind of like the Bible where it says Adam and Eve were the only people, and then suddenly there was giants. It's like, well, how did that happen? Well, this is the same thing with this story is, Lemuria and Atlantis were the only 2 civilizations on the world, but then it keeps alluding to the fact that there are still other civilizations in the world, and that's where I personally believe that, there was other things. But that these were 2 almost like experiment things is kind of what would happen, to have a completely feminine society and a completely masculine society. But what would happen if the masculine society, patriarchy and matriarchy, seems to be the case. But what the movie also is going on in the back of my mind is that here is the Garden of Eden. And you have Adam and Eve who are supposedly in tune with God. I look at them as childlike and very naive. I don't use naive to be mean. I use it just in the sense of, indicating a not so much state of wishful thinking, just not an aware state of everything that's going on. See, I have been very naive throughout my whole life. I was naive when I went to Paradise to see Janie, to meet him. I've had to grow up a lot over this past year, and I've lost a lot of naivety, a lot of innocence. That has been one of the hardest things for me, is my rose-colored glasses have completely fallen off, and I don't even know if it's possible to love anymore. So I'm seeing parallels here between this and being the Garden of Eden, Lemuria, and the serpent being Atlantis coming in with all these ideas of, you could be like God, or, you could be more. But in this case, it's, well, what if you used this whole other part of your brain? What if you allowed duality to enter? What if you decided to judge between good and evil? Or, you decided to have the knowledge, the judgment, So now you have the Atlanteans that have gone back to Atlantis. You have the remnant of Lemuria that went up to Hawaii. And you also have now this third group that stayed in the original Lemuria. So there's Lemuria 2 in Hawaii, and the original group that stayed in Lemuria. So you now have a third party in this group. If you look at masculine and feminine, you now have a group that could potentially represent unity, because they were able to be born again, in essence, to take their Atlantean ideas were still present, but then they were able to integrate the Lemurian ideas such that they became the corpus callosum in between the two hemispheres of the brain, and they were able to exist in both worlds. They were able to marry. It's the cosmic marriage of the bride and the bridegroom. This remnant, remnant, because they weren't Atlantean, they weren't Lemurian, they were something new. In essence, if you look at the Holy Trinity, you have, my interpretation of it is, you have the Mother, the Father, and the child. The way the Holy Trinity is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Holy Spirit, I believe, is Mother. And, Son represents child. We gotta balance out the masculine and feminine here, come on. So, then, the children, let's just say the children, ended up, they're the mix between Atlanteans and Lemurians now. The children end up they decide to go explore, and they go and find Hawaii. Suddenly, they're overwhelmed with extreme guilt, because it was I don't know if it was their ancestors or they themselves. It's kind of unclear to me whether or not these were the original people that actually did invade Lemuria, because at one point it indicates that they were thousands of years old by this point, and but that these were reincarnations. So I wasn't really sure, and doesn't matter. Regardless, they're now faced with a tremendous guilt complex. Well, our people hurt these people, and they're never going to accept us for who we are. Now I'm starting to also see parallels between what happened to me in my church, and how I am this very much third energy. There is the church, and then there is the rest of society. You could say the more science or logic or whatever, because the church wants to say they're so spiritual. But then there's me, who doesn't fit in anywhere, who I understand both sides, and I'm not going to give up one side or the other. I am learning to marry both parts of myself, and this is what the church still doesn't like about me, and this is why I'm considered evil. Really, this isn't going to make any sense. This is stream of consciousness. I'm just throwing this out here. These children go to New Lemuria on Hawaii. Somehow something ends up happening that love ends up winning this conflict, I guess. And a new portal is created. Now the Lemurians are able to look in on the Atlanteans, whereas the first portal, whatever that means, was the Atlanteans were able to look in on the Lemurians and then find the Lemurians and then come and conquer them. In this case, now the Lemurians are able to look in on the Atlanteans, and the Lemurians are now feeling what the Atlanteans are feeling, because there's a lot of war and strife and distance from God happening, and doing things that would be typically considered sin, or what I term as division, removing themselves from the wholeness of God, from source, is how, this gal puts it. And the Lemurians start to become really heavy in their heart. So now their hearts are very open, but they've never really actually been faced with the reality of what can happen once the mind comes online, once judgment or whatever comes online. So there was that pureness, that innocence was broken by viewing all this pain, heartache, brutality, and whatever was going on. So now these Lemurians are really confused. And at this point in the story, I become aware that the land is very much attached to the emotions of the Lemurians and the Atlanteans. So the Atlanteans, with what they're doing, end up destroying their whole country, civilization, whatever, it just falls into the ocean. I mean, we've heard stories about that. But it's this idea that this war amongst themselves, this distancing of themselves from source, ends up causing the destruction of their land. Well, the same thing happened in Lemuria. This sudden influx of all this emotion that they have never learned how to deal with an incredibly open heart chakra, but no wisdom to really figure out what is going on. So now they're stuck. They're thrown into this state of division and chaos, and probably removing themselves from source, and as such their land is starting to crumble into the ocean. So now you have a third exodus where they're heading to Mount Shasta. The only thing is and I never once ever considered that North America was the mainland of Lemuria, except for I had this weird, crazy, random idea that the part of British Columbia, Washington State, Oregon, and Northern California never used to be there geologically, and apparently they were all islands, and that came smashing in, and volcanic activity sealed the land together. Okay, so, but geologically they say that happened like 50 million years ago, but in my mind I knew that these islands were the lost islands of Lemuria. So in essence, where I live now is Lemuria. I just find that incredibly special. It makes a lot of sense to me. And I'm sorry, I would keep watching a bee that's flying around. And so they flee to Mount Shasta, but the only ones that are able to go underneath this mountain and enter this underground paradise are those that are pure of heart. So the Lemurians that are war-torn, in essence, their heart chakras are incredibly confused by all of this deluge of information, and their memories of the original invasion came back to them, and it's just they can't. It's like almost like I get the impression it's like they needed forgiveness, but they didn't know how to forgive because they couldn't even understand what happened in the first place. This reminds me totally of the plight of the child and how we end up bifurcating, not bifurcating, we just end up disassociating parts of ourselves in childhood whenever we experience particular traumas. We just can't deal with it, but we have to survive, so we end up cutting that part of ourselves off and moving on. I look at it with my Asperger's and dyslexia, and how I had no idea what was going on until like this past year or so. I've started figuring this out, and I'm 37, so but I had to learn coping mechanisms, and nobody in my school ever caught this, because I learned coping mechanisms that helped me figure out how to do things, but they weren't necessarily healthy coping mechanisms, and I didn't realize it until I go to start to teach Layla how to read and whatever, and I'm like, oh my gosh, why does everything she's doing look so familiar? And this is when I start looking really at myself. But it took 12 years for me to really figure out what was happening, because I finally started seeing where she was coming that's a different story. But coping mechanisms. So this is what these Lemurians were doing. They were trying to cope. They were trying to survive, but they couldn't. And so they perished. So some of them did end up making it down below Mount Shasta, but other ones fell. So you have Lemuria and Atlantis fall. But obviously there are still people on the world. Not just this one remnant of Lemuria. This is the remnant that went underground. And, now I keep thinking of like the Lost Tribes of Israel or something, or the Lost Tribe of Israel. I don't know. See, this is what started happening in my mind. I'm listening to this story, and all of a sudden, all this biblical context starts, falling in there. And I'm planting this here because my brain is going to have to go through and figure all this out. And, but the idea that ultimately resulted from all this was you have Atlantis, which represented the mind, and you have Lemuria, which represented the heart. And then there has to be, I used to listen to that group Enigma a lot, and there was this song that I loved listening to, Between Mind and Heart, Between Mind and Heart. And over the past year and a half since I met Jeannie, that phrase kept running through my head, between mind and heart. And I'm like, well, what does this mean? What is between mind and heart? And it just dawned on me yesterday, it's the throat chakra. And I've also, I've heard that blue is associated with the throat chakra, and I've been wearing a lot of blue lately. And when I first came back from Paradise, I realized there was a lot of sacral chakra work that was going on. And this has all been intuitively guided for me. So if I say something that totally doesn't align with what other people say, that's fine. I don't do any research. This is like I just pick up tidbits here and there because my guides lead me to one bit here, one bit there. And it's just like so random and all over the place. But somehow my mind puts it all together in something that makes sense to me. So now, though, over the past several weeks, I have been thinking more and more about throat chakra. Well, last night it finally dawned on me that was what between mind and heart was. This is the corpus callosum between the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere of the brain. The brain is not the mind. You could say the mind is the quote-unquote higher self, and the heart would be the lower self. I mean, I really hate that word lower and higher. It assigns priority in whatever to it. It's not. It's circular. It's spiritual. There is no hierarchy. And they're both spiritual. So our child self is just as much part of spirit as our higher self. Our inner child is our id, according, what Freud would talk about. And our super ego would be our higher self. That's what I subscribe to. That's what started making sense to me. So, where was I going? I think my new favorite word is so. So. Silly. Throat chakra. This is what this third energy represented, was throat chakra. Anyways, I'm going to end this now and figure out what exactly I was trying to say with that. So I love you. I'll talk those harsh shadows off my face. Love you. Bye. Come on.